Every night at exactly 11:45, when the city tucked itself into shadows and silence, Margaret Ashford would leash her two golden retrievers and disappear into the darkness, not toward the park, not down the well-lit avenue where other dog owners strolled. She walked straight into Crescent Alley, a narrow passage between crumbling brick buildings where street lights flickered and died, where even the rats seemed to move with caution. For 6 months, no one questioned it. Margaret was 73, a widow worth $12 million, living alone in a limestone mansion on Riverside Drive. She had staff, drivers, security, yet every single night she insisted on taking Duke and Bella into that alley herself. Alone, in the dark, her son, Thomas, had noticed. Of course he had noticed. Thomas Ashford was 46, successful, suspicious by nature, and profitable habit. He ran 3 investment firms, lived in a penthouse downtown, and visited his mother every Sunday for brunch, a ritual she never missed. But lately, Margaret had been different, distracted. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. She'd lost weight. Dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises, and she startled at sudden sounds. "Mother, you look exhausted," Thomas said one Sunday, watching her across the table laden with untouched pastries and fruit. "Are you sleeping?" "Perfectly well," Margaret replied, her voice smooth as silk over steel. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The dogs keep me active. It's good for my health." At midnight, in that alley, Thomas set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I saw you last Tuesday. I was driving home from the office." The room froze. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her gaze. Something ancient and afraid. "You're following me now?" Her tone remained pleasant, but the words carried an edge that could cut glass. "I was concerned. That alley is dangerous. You could hire someone to walk the dogs. You could use the park like a normal person." "Why do you insist on?" "Because it's none of your concern." Margaret stood, smoothing her cashmere cardigan with hands that barely shook. "I'm a grown woman, Thomas. I've lived through wars, recessions, your father's death, and I'll live through my son's misplaced worry. Now, shall we discuss something more pleasant? Or would you like to continue interrogating me in my own home?" Thomas backed down. He always did. Margaret Ashford had a way of making you feel like a scolded child with just a look, a tone, a tilt of her head. But this Timmy, as he drove away from the mansion, unease coiled in his stomach like a living thing. Something was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. That night, Thomas parked his Mercedes 3 blocks from his mother's house and waited. The October air bit through his coat, and fog rolled off the river in thick gray waves that turned streetlights into blurred halos. At 11:30, the front door opened. Margaret emerged in a dark coat, her white hair pinned up, Duke and Bella padding beside her on leather leashes. She moved with purpose, her stride quick and sure, despite her age. Thomas followed on foot, keeping to the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was absurd. He was a middle-aged man stalking his elderly mother through the streets like some paranoid detective. Yet he couldn't stop. The wrongness of it all pulled him forward like gravity. Margaret turned onto Crescent Alley. The narrow passage swallowed her whole. Darkness closed around her like a fist, and Thomas hesitated at the entrance, peering into the gloom. Graffiti scarred the walls. Overflowing dumpsters created obstacles in the path. Somewhere deeper in, something metal clanged against concrete. He stepped forward. The dog's tags jingled ahead. Margaret's footsteps echoed off brick. Thomas kept his distance, pressing against the wall, moving from shadow to shadow. His breath came fast and shallow. What was she doing? What could possibly justify this nightly pilgrimage into urban decay? Then the footsteps stopped. Thomas froze. Ahead, perhaps 50 feet into the alley's throat, Margaret stood perfectly still. The dog sat at her feet, silent and obedient. She seemed to be listening, waiting. A figure emerged from behind the dumpster, then another, and another. Thomas's blood turned to ice. 3 men, hulking shapes in the darkness, closing in on his mother. His hand dove for his phone, fingers fumbling with the emergency dial, but before he could press it, Margaret spoke. "Good evening, gentlemen." Right on time. Her voice carried no fear, no surprise. She sounded like she was greeting guests at a dinner party. The largest figure stepped forward into a shaft of weak light from a distant street lamp. Thomas expected a mugger, a threat, violent, about to unfold. But the man's face, when visible, showed something else entirely. Exhaustion, desperation, hunger that went deeper than the stomach. "Mrs. Ashford," the man said, and his voice cracked. "We didn't think you'd come. With the rain forecast and all ... I gave you my word, Margaret. I always keep my word." Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out something Thomas couldn't quite see. "How's your daughter? Did the medicine help?" The big man's shoulders shook. He pressed a hand to his face. "She's breathing easier. The fever broke." I don't know how to thank you. You just did." Margaret handed him something, then turned to the others. More shapes materialized from the darkness. 6, 8, 10 people, men and women both, emerging like ghosts from the alley's depths. They formed a quiet line, and Margaret moved down it, speaking to each person, handing them items from the deep pockets of her coat, touching shoulders, squeezing hands. Thomas stood paralyzed, watching this impossible scene unfold. His mother, the Margaret Ashford, who hosted charity galas and sat on museum boards, who wore pearls to breakfast and never had a hair out of place, was conducting some kind of ... what? Distribution center? Drug deal? His mind spun through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. If you've ever felt like the person you knew best in the world was suddenly a stranger, you'd understand what crashed through Thomas in that moment. Everything he thought he knew seemed to shift like sand beneath his feet. One woman, young and real thin, was crying. "My son starts school Monday. Real school, because of the supplies you brought. The clothes. He'll look like the other kids. He won't be ... Every child deserves dignity," Margaret said softly. "Tell him to work hard. Tell him education is the only wealth no one can steal." She moved through the group with the efficiency of long practice, and Thomas realized with startling clarity that this wasn't the first time. This wasn't new. This had been happening for months, every single night. A secret operation hidden in plain sight. Finally, Margaret reached the last person, an elderly man leaning heavily on a makeshift cane. She spoke with him for several minutes, too quiet for Thomas to hear, then pressed something into his hand and squeezed his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow," she told the assembled group. "Stay safe, stay warm, and remember, you all have value. You all matter." They dispersed like smoke, vanishing back into the darkness from which they'd come. Margaret stood alone for a moment, her shoulders sagging, the weight of whatever she carried settling onto her frame. Duke and Bella pressed against her legs, and she reached down to stroke their heads. Then she turned and began walking back toward the alley's entrance, toward Thomas. He had seconds to decide. Hide. Confront her. Pretend this never happened. But his body made the choice before his mind could, and he stepped into the center of the alley, directly in her path. Margaret stopped. For 3 long heartbeats, they stared at each other. The fog swirled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked finally. "Long enough." Thomas's voice came out, hoarse. "Mother, what the hell is going on?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She studied her son's face in the darkness, and Thomas saw something in her expression he'd never witnessed before. Not shame, not guilt, something harder. Something that looked almost like defiance mixed with bone-deep wariness. "Walk with me," she said finally. "We can't talk here." They moved in silence back toward Riverside Drive, the dogs padding between them. Thomas's mind raced with questions, accusations, demands for explanation, but the words tangled in his throat. The woman beside him was his mother, yet she suddenly seemed like a stranger wearing Margaret Ashford's face. Back at the mansion, Margaret led him to the library, a room filled with first editions and leather furniture that smelled of old money and older secrets. She poured 2 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter, handed one to Thomas, and settled into her favorite chair by the fireplace. The dogs curled at her feet. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you're about to pass out." Thomas sat, drank. The brandy burned, but it didn't clear the fog in his head. "How long, Mother? How long has this been going on?" 6 months and 14 days. Margaret sipped her own drink, her composure absolute. "Since late April." "Why?" The word exploded from Thomas. "You have charities? Foundations? You donate millions every year? Why are you sneaking into alleys at midnight like some kind of ... drug dealer? Criminal." Margaret's lips curved into a smile that held no humor. "I wondered when you'd follow me. I'm surprised it took this long." "Don't deflect. Answer the question." Margaret set down her glass and folded her hands in her lap, the gesture so familiar it made Thomas's chest ache. How many times had he seen her sit exactly that way? How many conversations had they shared in this room? Yet this felt like the first time he was truly seeing her. "Do you remember?" Margaret began, her voice taking on the quality of distant memory, "when you were 8 years old, and we found that family living under the bridge by the old railway yard?" Thomas frowned. Vaguely. "You gave them money. Food, I think. Your father wanted to call the police. Said they were probably criminals, drug addicts, a danger to the community. But I looked at that family, Thomas, a mother and 3 children living in cardboard boxers, and I saw myself." "What?" Thomas leaned forward. "That's impossible. You came from money. Grandfather owned half the textile mills in... My grandfather owned the mills." Margaret's voice cut through his words like a blade. "My father inherited nothing. He gambled it all away before I was 12 years old. Every penny, every property, everything." The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the arms of his chair. "You never told me this. I never told anyone." "Only your father knew, and he took that secret to his grave." Margaret's eyes grew distant, looking into a past Thomas had never glimpsed. "We were homeless for 2 years. My mother, my younger sister, and me. We lived in shelters when we could get in, slept in abandoned buildings when we couldn't, My sister died of pneumonia. The winter, she was 7, because we couldn't afford a doctor. Couldn't keep her warm enough. Couldn't save her. Silence crashed into the room like a wave. Thomas couldn't breathe. Couldn't process. His mother, the woman who'd raised him in luxury, who'd never wanted for anything, who'd taught him to appreciate fine wine and classical music, had been homeless, had watched her sister die in poverty. How, he managed. How did you, ... double quotes. I was smart. I was beautiful. And I was absolutely ruthless. Margaret's voice held no pride, just cold statement of fact. I clawed my way out by marrying your father. Robert was 20 years older, newly wealthy, and needed a wife who could navigate high society. I studied the right people, learned the right manners, bettered everything I'd been, and became Margaret Ashford. I played the part so well that even I forgot sometimes where I came from. Maybe that's what we all do, Thomas thought suddenly. Maybe we all build walls around the parts of ourselves that hurt too much to remember. Maybe his mother had been performing her entire adult life, and he'd never seen the actress beneath the role. But why now? Thomas asked. Why, after all these years, are you going back to that alley? Margaret stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden. Moonlight painted her profile in silver, and for the first time Thomas saw how small she looked, how fragile. Age had crept up on her when he wasn't watching, and the weight she carried had worn her down to something almost translucent. Last April, she said quietly, I was at the spring gala for the Arts Foundation. Champagne and caviar, designer gowns, everyone congratulating themselves on their generosity. We'd raised $2 million for youth programs. $2 million. It was a triumph. She paused, her breath fogging the window glass. On my way home, my driver took a detour. Construction. We drove through neighborhoods I'd successfully avoided for 40 years. And I saw them, Thomas. Dozens of them, hundreds. People living on the streets. Families. Children. Right here in our city, in the richest country in the world, people sleeping in doorways and digging through trash for food. Margaret turned, and tears glittered on her cheeks, the first tears Thomas had seen her shed since his father's funeral. I saw my sister's face in every child. I saw my mother's desperation in every woman's eyes. And I realized that for 50 years, I'd been so busy pretending to be someone else, so consumed with maintaining my position and protecting my comfort that I'd forgotten the most important thing. What thing? Thomas whispered. That I survived. That I made it out. And that means I have an obligation to those who haven't. Margaret crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. The foundations and galas are lovely, Thomas. They help. But the money gets filtered through administrators and boards and bureaucracy. By the time it reaches the people who need it, it has been diluted into programs and initiatives that sound impressive, but do UNT feed a hungry child tonight or keep a mother warm in November? So you decided to do it yourself. Thomas saw it now, the complete picture forming like a photograph in developing solution. The alley, the direct contact, cash and supplies, no middlemen, no delays. Marcus was the first. He approached me in the park one afternoon, asking if I had spare change. We started talking. He'd been a mechanic, had a family, lost his job when the factory closed, lost his apartment, lost everything. But he was trying so hard to hold on to his dignity. I could see it in the way he apologized for asking, the way he couldn't meet my eyes. Margaret's voice strengthened, growing fierce. I gave him $100, told him to meet me in that alley the next night. He brought his daughter, who had asthma and no insurance. I bought her medication. Word spread. More people came. People who'd been invisible to everyone else, who'd learned to hide because society punishes poverty like it's a moral failing. And you've been going every night since. Thomas's mind spun with implications. How much have you spent? Does it matter? Mother, you can't just hand out cash in dark alleys indefinitely. It's not sustainable. It's not safe. What you're doing is necessary. Margaret pulled her hands away, her expression hardening. Don't you dare lecture me about sustainability. I'm dying, Thomas. Everything stopped. Time froze. The words hung in the air between them like suspended knives. What? Thomas's voice came from very far away. Stage 4. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe 8, if I'm lucky. Margaret said it calmly, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. I'm not doing chemotherapy. I'm not spending my last months sick and weak fighting a battle I can't win. I'm spending them doing something that matters. Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't think. His mother's words echoed in his skull, but his brain refused to process them. Dying. 6 months. Stage 4. So, you see, Margaret continued, moving back to her chair, sustainability isn't the issue. I have more money than I could possibly spend in 6 months living normally. Why shouldn't I use it to help people who need it desperately? Why shouldn't I try to balance the scales? Just a little, before I go. The alley suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. Not recklessness. Not some kind of breakdown. Purpose. Her last act of defiance against a world that had tried to destroy her once and failed. Thomas didn't leave the mansion that night. He couldn't. The revelation about his mother's illness had hollowed him out, left him sitting in the library long after Margaret went to bed, staring at nothing while Duke and Bella watched him with concerned golden eyes. Dying. The word kept circling his mind like a vulture. His mother was dying, and instead of telling him, instead of letting him help, she'd chosen to spend her final months in a dark alley, distributing money to strangers. Part of him wanted to rage at her for the secrecy. Part of him wanted to weep, but the largest part, the part that was Robert Ashford's son and Margaret's child, wanted to understand. He thought he'd known her. Thought he'd understood the woman who'd raised him with firm expectations and unwavering love, who'd insisted he'd learn both classical piano and street fighting, who'd taught him that wealth was a responsibility, not a reward. But the story she'd told tonight had reframed everything. Every lesson, every dinner conversation, every moment of his childhood suddenly looked different when viewed through the lens of her hidden past. She'd been homeless. Her sister had died. His grandmother had struggled to keep them alive. And Margaret had survived through sheer determination and strategic marriage, then spent 50 years maintaining a fiction so complete that even her own son had believed it absolutely. At dawn, Thomas found her in the kitchen making coffee, already dressed for the day in slacks and a silk blouse, her white hair perfectly coiffed. She looked tired but composed, and when she saw him, she simply poured a second cup and slid it across the marble counter. "You look terrible," she observed. Learned from the best, Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "We need to talk." "Really talk?" I told you everything last night. You told me facts. You didn't tell me what happens next. Thomas set down the coffee, forcing himself to meet her eyes. What's your plan, Mother? You can't keep going to that alley every night. What happens when you're too weak? When the cancer progresses, I manage until I can't. Margaret's voice remained steady. I've calculated my resources. I can continue at current distribution levels for approximately 7 months before my liquid assets run low. That should be sufficient. Sufficient for what? You're talking about your death like it's a business transaction. Thomas heard his voice rising and couldn't stop it. You're my mother. You're dying, and you're spending your last months with strangers instead of with me. Instead of your family. Family. Margaret repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. You'll visit me once a week, Thomas. For brunch, we discuss your business ventures and the weather, and then you return to your penthouse and your life. That's fine. I raised you to be independent, successful. But don't pretend I'm abandoning some deep daily connection we've maintained. We've been polite to each other for years. The words hit like physical blows, mainly because they were true. When had he last had a real conversation with his mother? When had they discussed anything beyond surface pleasantries? He'd been busy building his empire, and she'd been maintaining her social obligations, and somehow years had passed in pleasant, meaningless exchanges. That's going to change, Thomas said. Starting now. Margaret studied him over her coffee cup. What do you mean? I mean I'm coming with you. Tonight to the alley, and every night after that, until ... Double quotes. He couldn't finish the sentence. Until she died. Until cancer took her. Until his mother became nothing but memory and grief. Absolutely not. Margaret set down her cup with enough force to make it click against the marble. This is my project, my mission. I don't need you swooping in to manage or control it. I'm not trying to manage anything. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to spend time with my dying mother while I still can. Thomas felt something crack in his chest. Some wall he'd maintained for too long finally giving way. Please, Mother, let me do this. Let me understand. They stared at each other across the kitchen island. Outside, the city was waking up, traffic building, people starting their days unaware that Thomas Ashford's entire world had shifted on its axis in the space of 12 hours. Finally, Margaret sighed. You'll wear dark clothing, no jewelry, no expensive watch. You'll follow my lead and speak only when spoken to, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately. Agreed? Agreed. That night, Thomas dressed in old jeans and a black jacket he'd worn to college, feeling ridiculous and nervous in equal measure. Margaret met him at the mansion's side door at 11:30, eyebrow raised at his outfit, but saying nothing. They walked together through the fog-wrapped streets, Duke and Bella trotting between them toward Crescent Alley. As they approached the narrow opening, Thomas felt his heartbeat accelerate. In daylight, the alley looked merely shabby, a forgotten space between buildings. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. A threshold. A border between the world of comfort Thomas inhabited and the world of need his mother had chosen to enter. Lost chance to back out, Margaret murmured. Not happening. They walked into darkness. The alley swallowed them, and Thomas's eyes struggled to adjust. He heard voices ahead, whispers, and soft conversation. Shapes materialized from the shadows, and suddenly they were surrounded by people. 10 15, maybe 20 individuals standing in small clusters, waiting. "Mrs. Ashford," someone called softly. "Evening." "Good evening, Maria." Margaret's voice took on a warmth Thomas rarely heard. "How's the baby?" "Growing. Strong. The formula you brought is working perfectly." A young woman stepped forward, and in the dim light, Thomas could see she was barely 20, hollow-cheeked, but smiling. "I don't know how to thank you. You just did." Margaret reached into her coat, pulling out an envelope. "I added extra this week. Make sure you're eating enough too. A baby needs a healthy mother." They moved through the group, and Thomas watched his mother transform. With these people, in this place, she dropped every pretense of society matron. She laughed, she hugged, she listened with complete attention to every story, every update, every small triumph or setback. She knew names, remembered details, asked follow-up questions that proved she genuinely cared about the answers. Marcus, the large man from the previous night, approached Thomas. "You must be the son. Mrs. Ashford mentioned you might come." "She did." Thomas glanced at his mother, surprised. "Said you were a good man who needed to understand some things." Marcus held out a calloused hand. "Marcus Chun, former mechanic, currently residing in a shelter on 3rd Street when they have space, under the bridge when they don't." Thomas shook his hand, feeling the strength in the grip. "Thomas Ashford, investment banker, currently residing in a penthouse and feeling deeply uncomfortable about it." Marcus laughed, a deep rumble that held genuine humor. "Don't be. We're not looking for guilt. Your mother doesn't come here out of guilt. She comes because she sees us." "Really sees us? Do you know how rare that is?" Thomas watched Margaret kneeling to talk to a child, maybe 6 years old, showing him a picture book she'd brought. The boy's face lit up with wonder, and Margaret's expression held such tenderness that Thomas felt his throat tighten. "She told me about her past," Thomas said quietly. "Last night, I never knew about being homeless." "Yeah, she mentioned it to a few of us." Marcus turned to watch Margaret too. "That's why we trust her. She's not slumming. She's not here for the feel-good story. She knows what it's like to be invisible, to be judged, to be afraid every single day that this is how your life ends." Over the next hour, Thomas met more people. Sarah, a former teacher who lost everything in a house fire and couldn't afford to rebuild her life. James, a veteran with PTSD who couldn't hold down a job but was trying desperately to stay sober. Linda and her teenage daughter fleeing an abusive situation and living out of their car. Each person had a story. Each story was different, but they all shared one thing. They'd fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to catch them, and his mother had become their safety net. "Why didn't she just give you all enough to get apartments?" Thomas asked Marcus. "She has the money. She could set everyone here up permanently." Marcus's expression grew sad. "She's tried. Some people she's helped that way when she's sure they're ready. But it's not always that simple. Some of us have criminal records, bad credit, mental health issues, addiction problems. Landlords won't rent to us, even with money up front. The system is designed to keep us out once we're down." "That's insane." "That's reality." Marcus shrugged. "But what your mother does, the immediate help, the dignity, the consistent presence, that keeps us alive, keeps us hoping. And for some of us, hope is the difference between trying another day and giving up completely." Margaret approached them, her coat pockets now empty, ready to go. Thomas nodded, and they said their goodbyes, walking back toward the alley's entrance. As they emerged onto the street, Thomas felt fundamentally altered, as if he'd stepped through more than just physical darkness. The nightly visits became routine. Thomas started leaving his office earlier, arriving at the mansion by 11, changing into his alley clothes, while Margaret prepared the supplies. She'd converted a spare room into what she called her operations center. Shelves stocked with non-perishable food, toiletries, warm clothing, first aid supplies, and envelopes of cash organized by recipient. "You're incredibly organized about this," Thomas observed one evening, watching her sort through items with practiced efficiency. "I was a business owner's wife for 30 years. I learned how to run operations." Margaret placed bandages into a canvas bag. "The difference is that instead of managing charity, I'm managing something that actually matters." The galas mattered. They raised millions. They raised money that paid administrative salaries and funded programs that looked good on paper but changed very few lives. Margaret's voice held no bitterness, just weary acceptance. "I'm not saying they were useless, but they were inefficient. What we do in that alley is direct action. Every dollar I spend reaches someone who needs it within hours." Thomas couldn't argue. Over the weeks, he'd watched his mother's money transform lives in immediate, tangible ways. Marcus's daughter had gotten her asthma medication. Sarah had found a data entry job after Margaret paid for new professional clothes and covered her first month's rent. James had entered a treatment program. Linda and her daughter had moved into a studio apartment with furniture Margaret had purchased. But not everyone could be saved so some people's problems ran too deep, their situations too complex for money alone to fix. Thomas learned to recognize the difference between temporary hardship and systemic entrapment, and he began to understand his mother's calculated approach. She helped those she could help permanently, and she kept the others stable until better opportunities emerged. "You've thought of everything," Thomas said, watching her work. "I've tried, but I'm running out of time." Margaret paused, one hand pressed against her abdomen in a gesture. Thomas now recognized his pain. She was taking medication, refusing anything stronger than over-the-counter painkillers because she wanted to stay sharp. The cancer was progressing. Some mornings she was pale and shaking. Some nights she could barely walk home from the alley. But she never missed a single evening. "Mother, you need to rest more. Maybe we skip tonight." "We're not skipping." Her voice hardened. "These people depend on me. They arrange their entire lives around this nightly meeting. Do you know what it does to someone's psyche when the one reliable thing in their life disappears?" Thomas knew better than to argue. Instead, he finished packing the supplies and followed her into the night. The November cold had deepened, frost glittering on sidewalks, their breath visible in clouds. Margaret walked slower now, leaning more heavily on Duke's solid presence, but she still moved with determination. In the alley, the group had grown. Word had spread about the rich lady who came every night with help. Now 25, sometimes 30 people waited in the darkness. Margaret knew every name, every story, every need. "Mrs. Ashford." A new voice called. Someone said, "You might be able to help me." A young man stepped forward, maybe 30, with haunted eyes and track marks on his arms visible, even in the dim light. Thomas tensed, ready to step between him and his mother, but Margaret simply smiled. "What's your name?" "Daniel." I'm trying to get clean. I've been using for 5 years, but I want to stop. The shelters all have waiting lists. The free clinics won't see me without insurance. I don't know what to do." Margaret studied him for a long moment. Thomas had learned she could read people with uncanny accuracy, could tell who was genuinely ready for help versus who was just looking for money to feed their addiction. "Have you used today?" she asked quietly. Daniel's shoulders slumped. "This morning, but I want to stop. I really do. I just don't know how." Wanting to stop is the first step. Margaret reached into her bag, pulling out a card. "This is a private treatment facility. I've already called ahead. They're expecting someone to show up, and they'll take you regardless of ability to pay. I'm covering the first month." Daniel stared at the card like it might vanish. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "I know what it's like to be desperate. I know what it's like when the system fails you." Margaret pressed the card into his hand. "Don't waste this chance. Get clean. Build a life. And someday, when you're stable and successful, help someone else who's where you are now. That's all I ask." Thomas watched Daniel walk away, clutching the card, and something shifted in his chest. This was what his mother did. She didn't just give money. She gave chances. She gave hope. She gave people the thing they needed most. The belief that they mattered, that someone saw them as human beings worthy of saving. "You can't save everyone," Thomas murmured. "I know, but I can save some, and some is better than none." Margaret swayed slightly, and Thomas caught her elbow. "I'm fine, just tired." She wasn't fine. Thomas could see it in the gray pallor of her skin, the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. The cancer was eating her from the inside, and she was spending her remaining strength on strangers. That night, after they returned to the mansion, Thomas made a decision. He called his assistant at home, waking her up despite the late hour. "I need you to clear my schedule for the next 6 months," he said. "Everything, every meeting, every conference, every obligation. Delegate what you can. Cancel the rest." "Sir, that's going to—" "I don't care what it's going to do. Do it." He hung up and found his mother in the kitchen, making tea with shaking hands. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked. "I'm taking a leave of absence from my companies. I'm moving back here. And I'm going to help you do this properly. Thomas, you can't abandon your career, your dying mother." The words came out harsh, brutal, but necessary. "You have maybe 5 months left, maybe less. I'm not spending that time in board meetings and conference calls. I'm spending it with you. I'm learning everything you know about those people in the alley. And when you're gone, I'm going to continue what you started." Margaret set down her teacup, and for the second time since this began, Thomas saw tears on her face. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do. You asked me once why I visited only on Sundays. Why we'd become polite strangers. It's because I was so busy chasing success that I forgot what actually matters." Thomas crossed to her, taking her fragile hands in his. "You're giving me a gift, Mother. You're showing me what a life of meaning looks like. The least I can do is honor that by carrying it forward." They stood together in the kitchen, and Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A connection, a understanding, a bridge finally built across the distance that had grown between them. Over the following weeks, Margaret taught him everything. How to assess who needed immediate help versus long-term support. How to distribute resources fairly. How to maintain boundaries while still showing compassion. How to spot con artists and genuine need. How to keep records without compromising anyone's privacy. How to build trust with people who'd been betrayed by every system meant to help them. Thomas absorbed it all, taking notes, asking questions, learning to see the city through his mother's eyes. The invisible people suddenly became visible. The homeless man on the corner had a name, Miguel, and a story about lost construction work. The woman begging outside the grocery store was Rachel, saving money to reunite with her children in foster care. The teenage boy sleeping in doorways was Kevin, aging out of the system with nowhere to go. They were everywhere, once you learned to look, and Thomas finally understood what his mother had been trying to tell him. That wealth wasn't about accumulation. It was about circulation, about taking what you had and using it to lift others up, not as charity, but as basic human obligation. "You're getting better at this," Margaret said one night as they walked home from the alley. December had arrived, bringing snow that muffled the city's noise. "You actually listened to Kevin tonight, really listened. He wants to go to trade school. Become an electrician." Thomas adjusted his grip on the supply bags, now perpetually part of his nightly routine. "I'm going to pay for it. The full program. Books, tools, everything." Margaret smiled, the expression brightening her drawn face. "You're learning." "I had a good teacher." Thomas slowed his pace to match hers, noticing how much effort each step now required. "Though I wish I'd started learning sooner. You're learning now. That's what matters." She squeezed his arm. "Thomas, I need you to promise me something." The seriousness in her tone made him stop walking. "Anything. When I'm gone, don't turn this into a foundation. Don't formalize it or bureaucratize it. Keep it exactly as it is. Personal, direct, human." Christmas approached, and Margaret's condition deteriorated. Some mornings she couldn't get out of bed. Her appetite vanished. Pain became her constant companion, sharp and grinding, turning every movement into an act of will. But still, every night at 11:45, she made it to that alley. Thomas tried to convince her to rest, to let him handle the distributions alone. But she refused with the same iron determination that had carried her from homelessness to high society. "I need to see them," she insisted. "I need to know they're okay. I need to be there." So Thomas supported her through the increasingly difficult walks, practically carrying her some nights, watching helplessly as cancer consumed his mother piece by piece. The people in the alley noticed. They brought her chairs to sit in. They asked after her health with genuine concern. They told her to rest, to take care of herself, and she laughed at the irony of homeless people worrying about a dying millionaire. "You've given us so much," Marcus said one frozen December night. "What can we give you?" "You already have." Margaret's voice had grown thin, papery. "You've given me purpose. You've given me a chance to make amends for 50 years of looking away. You've let me be Margaret again, not Mrs. Ashford. That's more than enough." On Christmas Eve, Margaret insisted on doing something special. She'd arranged for a catering company to deliver hot meals to the alley, proper restaurant-quality food served in containers that kept everything warm. She'd bought new winter coats for everyone, gloves, scarves, thermal underwear. She'd wrapped presents for the children, age-appropriate gifts chosen with care. The alley transformed into something almost magical that night. Someone brought a battery-powered radio, playing carols. People shared food and stories, laughing despite their circumstances. For a few hours, the darkness lifted, and Thomas saw what his mother had been building all along. Not just a distribution system, a community, a family bound by shared struggle and mutual care. Margaret sat in a folding chair Marcus had brought, wrapped in blankets, watching the celebration with tears streaming down her face. Thomas knelt beside her. "Are you in pain?" he asked quietly. "Yes, but it's good pain, the kind that reminds you you're still alive." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for understanding. I'm the one who should be thanking you for showing me what matters, for teaching me to see." Thomas's voice broke. "I don't want to lose you, Mother. I know. But when you do, you won't really lose me. I'll be in every person you help, every kindness you show, every moment you choose to see instead of looking away." Margaret touched his cheek, and her hand felt like paper, like she might dissolve at any moment. "Promise me you'll keep this going. Promise me these people won't be abandoned when I'm gone. I promise." "I swear it." "Good." She smiled, and for a moment Thomas saw past the illness to the woman she'd been. Strong, fierce, unbreakable. Now go distribute those presents. The children are waiting. Thomas stood and grabbed the bag of wrapped gifts, calling out names and handing packages to wide-eyed kids who'd probably never had a Christmas like this before. Their joy was infectious, spreading through the alley like light, and he understood why his mother had spent her final months here instead of in some hospital bed. This was living. This was meaning. This was everything that mattered, distilled into its purest form. Maybe some of you reading this have someone in your life whose time is running out. Maybe you've been given the gift of knowing they won't be here forever. If so, please, don't waste that time. Learn from them. Listen to them. Let them teach you what they've learned about being human, about being kind, about being brave enough to care when caring is hard. After the celebration ended and people drifted back to their shelters or doorways or cars, Thomas helped Margaret home. She could barely walk now, leaning heavily on him with every step. Inside the mansion, he carried her to her bedroom, something that would have mortified her months ago, but which she now accepted with quiet gratitude. "I need to tell you something," Margaret whispered as he settled her into bed. "About your father." Thomas sat on the edge of the mattress. "What about him?" "He knew about my past, about my sister, and he never once made me feel lesser for it." Margaret's eyes grew distant. "I thought he married me for appearances, and maybe at first he did, but over Chimi he fell in love with who I really was, not the persona I'd created. On his deathbed, he made me promise to stop hiding, to stop pretending, to use our money for something that mattered." "Is that why you started going to the alley?" "Partly, but also because I was dying, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world having wasted my second chance." She gripped his hand. "Your father gave me wealth and security, but I gave myself purpose. That's what I want for you, Thomas. Find your purpose. Chase it with everything you have. Don't wait until you're dying to start really living." "I won't. I promise." Thomas kissed her forehead. "Rest now. I'll handle everything. Wake me at 11:30. I'm going to the alley tomorrow." "Mother, it's Christmas." "You need to rest." "They'll understand. Wake me at 11:30. "Thomas, I'm not missing a night." "Not yet." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that her health was more important than one night's distribution. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the absolute refusal to surrender before she absolutely had to, and he recognized it as the same quality that had carried her through homelessness, through building a new identity, through 50 years of pretending to be someone else. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll wake you." He left her room and walked through the mansion's empty halls, seeing it differently now. All this luxury, all this wealth, and it had taken his mother's impending death to teach him that none of it mattered compared to human connection, compared to purpose, compared to the look on a hungry child's face when you hand them a warm meal and treat them with dignity. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the library with Duke and Bella, thinking about everything that had changed in the past 2 months. He'd left his companies in capable hands, moved back into his childhood bedroom, and begun building a life around his mother's mission. Some of his business associates thought he'd lost his mind. Some understood. Most didn't care as long as their investments kept generating returns. But Thomas had never felt more sane, more grounded, more certain of his place in the world. The work he did in that alley, the conversations he had with people society had written off, the small victories and crushing setbacks, all of it felt more real than anything he'd done in his previous life. At 11:30 Christmas Day, he woke Margaret as promised. She could barely sit up. Her skin had taken on a yellow tinge, and her breathing rattled in her chest. Thomas wanted to call an ambulance to get her to the hospital immediately, but she refused. "One more night," she whispered. "Please, Thomas, give me one more night." So he helped her dress, wrapped her in the warmest coat she owned, and carried her most of the way to Crescent Alley. The people were waiting, their faces falling when they saw Margaret's condition. Marcus stepped forward, his large frame blocking the wind. "Mrs. Ashford, you shouldn't be here. You should be resting." "I'm exactly where I should be." Margaret's voice was barely audible, but it still carried that note of absolute certainty. "Now, who's first?" They came forward one by one, but this time they weren't asking for anything. They brought her things. A drawing from one of the children, carefully folded. A rosary someone's grandmother had owned. A harmonica that had seen better days. Small gifts, worthless in monetary terms, but priceless in meaning. "We wanted you to know," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, "that you changed our lives. That you mattered. That we'll never forget what you did for us." Margaret accepted each gift with trembling hands, and Thomas saw the naked emotion on her face. Love, gratitude, peace. His mother, who'd spent 50 years hiding behind propriety and performance, had finally found her real family. Not in society ballrooms, but in a dark alley among people who had nothing but gave everything. They stayed for an hour, longer than they should have, because no one wanted to say goodbye. But finally, Margaret was too weak to continue. Thomas carried her home through streets silent with snow, feeling her weight decrease with every step, as if she were becoming less substantial, preparing to disappear entirely. Back at the mansion, he tucked her into bed and sat beside her, holding her hand through the long dark hours of the night. Margaret slipped into unconsciousness on December 20th. Thomas moved her to the master bedroom on the ground floor, converted it into a hospice room with the help of nurses who came and went on silent feet. The cancer had spread everywhere now, consuming her from within, but she'd fought until the absolute end. Thomas kept his promise. Every night at 11:45, he took Duke and Bella to Crescent Alley. The people gathered, as always, but the atmosphere had changed. They knew. Somehow, they all knew that Margaret's time was ending, and their grief was palpable, heavy as the winter air. "How is she?" Marcus asked the question they all wanted answered. "Fading. The doctors say it could be days, maybe hours." Thomas distributed the supplies Margaret had prepared in advance. Envelopes labeled with names, specific items set aside for specific people. She'd thought of everything, planned for this moment, ensured that even in death she wouldn't abandon them. "She wanted me to tell you all something," she said, "that knowing you, helping you, gave her life meaning. She said you saved her as much as she saved any of you. We should be there, Sarah said. We should say goodbye. She wouldn't want you to see her like this. Thomas's throat tightened. She'd want you to remember her as she was, strong, determined, unafraid. But over the next few days, as Margaret's breathing grew more labored, and her moments of consciousness, fewer people from the alley began appearing at the mansion. They stood outside the gates in a silent vigil, dozens of them, holding candles that flickered in the January cold. They didn't ask to come in, didn't demand anything. They simply stood witness to the passing of someone who'd seen them when the rest of the world looked away. Thomas found Marcus among the crowd on the third night and invited him in. Together, they sat by Margaret's bedside. She was barely there now, her body a fragile shell, her breathing shallow and irregular. But when Marcus took her hand, her eyes fluttered open. You came, she whispered. Of course I came. Marcus's voice broke. You changed my life, Mrs. Ashford. You gave me hope when I had none. You helped me get my daughter back, get a job, get an apartment. I'm nobody special. I'm just a guy who had bad luck. But you treated me like I mattered. You do matter, Margaret managed. You all matter. Don't forget that. Don't ever forget. She faded back into unconsciousness, and Marcus sat with her for another hour before leaving, tears streaming down his weathered face. After him came Sarah, then James, then Linda and her daughter. One by one, the people Margaret had helped filed through, saying their goodbyes, leaving tokens of gratitude on the nightstand. A stone polished smooth, a feather, a poem written in shaky handwriting, small things that meant everything. On January 4th, as dawn broke over the city, Margaret Ashford took her final breath. Thomas was holding her hand. Duke and Bella pressed against the bed, and for a moment the room felt full of something he couldn't name. Presence, peace, completion. She was 73 years old. She'd been homeless, she'd been wealthy. She'd been both invisible and celebrated, and in her final months, she'd chosen to spend her remaining time not on comfort or legacy building or saying goodbye to a lifetime of acquaintances, but on helping strangers in a dark alley. Thomas sat with her body for a long time, crying in a way he hadn't since childhood, letting grief wash through him in waves. But underneath the pain was something else. Gratitude, pride, understanding. His mother had taught him more in her last months than in all the years before combined. The funeral was unusual by society standards. Thomas held two services. The first was at the cathedral downtown, attended by all the people Margaret had known in her society life. Philanthropists and board members, art collectors and business leaders, everyone wearing black and making appropriate noises about what a loss this was to the community. It was elegant, proper, exactly what Margaret Ashford, society matron, would have expected. The second service happened in Crescent Alley. Thomas arranged for heaters and lights, transforming the narrow passage into something warm and bright. More than 100 people showed up. Everyone Margaret had helped directly, plus others who'd heard about what she'd done. There were no programs, no formalidades, no rigid structure. People simply stood up and spoke. She gave me my dignity back, one man said. She made me believe I could be more than my circumstances, a woman added. She saved my daughter's life. Marcus's voice carried through the alley, strong despite his tears. Story after story emerged, painting a picture of Margaret that would have shocked her society friends. This wasn't the composed woman who sat on museum boards. This was someone raw and real, someone who'd looked suffering in the eye and refused to blink, someone who'd used her wealth, the the way it was meant to be used, as a tool for transformation rather than accumulation. When the testimonials ended, Thomas stood up. He'd prepared a speech, written and rewritten it dozens of times. But standing there in that alley, surrounded by people his mother had saved, he forgot every word. "My mother kept secrets," he said finally. "She hid her past, her pain, her truth for 50 years. But in the end, she stopped hiding. She let herself be seen, and in doing so, she taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned." He paused, looking at the faces around him, young and old, diverse and united, all connected by one woman's determination to make a difference. "She taught me that we're not separate, that wealth doesn't make you better, and poverty doesn't make you lesser, that we're all just people struggling to survive, looking for meaning, trying to matter. She taught me that the only thing that truly counts in this life is how we treat each other in the darkness." Thomas pulled out an envelope, the last one Margaret had prepared. His name was written on it in her shaky handwriting. "She left this for me. I'm going to read it now, because I think she'd want you all to hear it." He opened the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. Her handwriting was barely legible, written during one of her last conscious moments, but the words were clear. "Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone." "Good. I was ready." The pain was becoming unbearable, and I'd done everything I set out to do. "I need you to understand something. This wasn't about charity. This was about balance. The universe gave me a second chance when I deserved none. I clawed my way out of poverty through manipulation and strategic marriage, and I spent 50 years enjoying luxury built on calculated deception. I owed a debt these people in the alley. They're who I would have remained if your father hadn't rescued me. And they deserve the same chance I got. Not because they're special or worthy, but because they're human. Because we're all one bad day, one piece of bad luck, one wrong turn away from being exactly where they are. Continue this work, not as a foundation or organization. Keep it personal. Keep it direct. Let it be messy and inefficient and human. That's the only way it stays real. I love you. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took dying to show you who I really was. But better late than never, right? Use the money well. Use it all. That's what it's for." Mother Thomas folded the letter, his vision blurred by tears. Around him, people were crying too, grieving a woman most of them had known for only months, but who'd changed their lives forever. "So that's what I'm going to do," Thomas said, his voice stronger now. "I'm going to continue this. Every night. Same time, same place. For as long as people need it. Because that's what she wanted. That's what she deserves. And that's what you all deserve." Marcus stepped forward and pulled Thomas into a fierce hug. Others followed, embracing him, thanking him, promising to help however they could. The alley filled with the sound of people crying and laughing and remembering, celebrating a life that had ended but whose impact would ripple forward indefinitely. Later, after everyone had left and the heaters were packed away, Thomas stood alone in the alley with Duke and Bella. He looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings, stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. "I won't let you down," he whispered. "I promise." A cold wind blew through the passage, and for just a moment, Thomas could have sworn he felt his mother's hand on his shoulder. Proud, grateful, finally at peace. 6 months after Margaret's death, Thomas had transformed into someone his former business associates barely recognized. He'd lost weight from the physical demands of the work. His expensive suits hung in a closet unused. His penthouse sat empty while he lived in the mansion, which he'd converted into a more efficient operation center for what he now called the Alley Project. He'd kept his promise to keep it informal, but he'd also recognized that sustainability required some structure. He couldn't personally hand out supplies every night for decades. He needed help, so he recruited carefully, bringing in people who understood the mission, who'd experienced hardship themselves, who could maintain the personal touch his mother had established. Marcus became his partner. After getting stable housing and steady work, Marcus had approached Thomas with an idea. He knew the people in the alley better than anyone. He could identify who needed help, who was ready for more substantial assistance, who might take advantage. Together, they created a system that preserved Margaret's vision while expanding its reach. Sarah, the former teacher, started an informal tutoring program in a rented community space, helping people prepare for their GED tests or develop job skills. James, now 2 years sober, ran peer support groups for others struggling with addiction. Linda worked as an advocate, helping people navigate the bureaucratic nightmares of social services, housing assistance, and legal aid. The Alley Project wasn't a traditional charity. It didn't have a board of directors or annual galas. It ran on Margaret's money, which Thomas discovered was even more substantial than he'd known. She'd left instructions for her entire estate, $12 million minus the mansion, to be placed in a trust dedicated to continuing her work. Thomas added his own money, selling off investments and funneling the profits into the trust. They could run for years, decades, if managed properly, and Thomas intended to manage it very properly indeed. But it wasn't easy. Some nights, Thomas returned to the mansion so exhausted he could barely climb the stairs. The work was relentless. For every person they helped successfully transition back into stable life, 3 more appeared, desperate and afraid. The city's affordable housing crisis worsened. Mental health services remained inadequate. The social safety net continued to fray. Sometimes, Thomas felt like he was trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The problems were so vast, so systemic, so deeply embedded in policy and economics and social structures that no amount of direct aid could truly solve them. He'd lie awake at night thinking about this, wondering if his mother had simply wasted her final months on a beautiful but ultimately futile gesture. Then he'd remember Kevin. Kevin, the teenage boy aging out of foster care, had used Margaret's money to attend trade school. He'd graduated top of his class, gotten his electrician's license, and started his own small business. 6 months ago, he'd appeared at the mansion with a check for $5,000. "I want to pay it forward," Kevin had said, pressing the check into Thomas's hands. "Mrs. Ashford gave me a chance when nobody else would. This is my first profit. I wanted to go to someone like me." Thomas had accepted the check, and they'd used it to help another young person in a similar situation. That person was now working toward becoming a plumber. The cycle continued, rippling outward. Margaret's initial investment multiplying through the lives it touched. That was when Thomas understood. His mother hadn't been trying to solve systemic poverty. She'd been creating a different kind of system, one based on human connection and mutual aid, one that ran parallel to the official structures and caught people those structures missed. On the 6-month anniversary of Margaret's death, Thomas organized a gathering in Crescent Alley. He'd invited everyone she'd ever helped, plus their families, plus the new people the Alley Project had reached since her passing. The narrow passage couldn't hold them all. They spilled out onto the sidewalks, over 100 people representing countless acts of kindness. Thomas had installed a plaque on the alley wall, bronze, simple, bearing Margaret's name and dates. with a single line underneath. She saw us when we were invisible. He unveiled it that night, and people pressed forward to touch it, to trace her name with their fingers, to pay their respects to someone who'd given them back their humanity. Marcus spoke, his voice carrying through the crowd. Mrs. Ashford used to say that none of us are more than 1 or 2 pieces of bad luck away from being where we were. She was right. But she also showed us that none of us are more than 1 or 2 acts of genuine kindness away from getting back up. That's her legacy. That's what we're here to continue. After the ceremony, as people shared food and stories, a woman Thomas didn't recognize approached him. She was professionally dressed, confident, but her eyes held shadows he'd learned to recognize. "You don't know me," she said, "but your mother helped my sister 3 years ago. Before the alley, before any of this was organized. My sister was homeless, living under a bridge, and your mother just stopped, talked to her, gave her money for a hotel and helped finding a job. My sister is a nurse now, has an apartment, is rebuilding her life." The woman's voice cracked. "I never got to thank your mother. She died before I could find her again. But I wanted you to know that what she did, what you're doing, it matters. It saves lives, real lives. My sister would be dead now if not for your mother's kindness." Thomas accepted her thanks, but what struck him most was the timeline. 3 years ago. His mother had been doing this even longer than he'd known. The alley was just the formalization of something she'd been doing informally for years, stopping to help people others walked past, seeing humanity where society saw problems. How many people had she touched? How many lives had she changed in those quiet, unrecorded moments? Thomas would never know the full extent of his mother's impact. The thought was humbling and inspiring in equal measure. Late that night, after everyone had left, and the alley returned to its usual darkness, Thomas sat on the cold ground with his back against the wall where the plaque hung. Duke and Bella lay beside him, their solid warmth comforting. He pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he'd taken of his mother, snapped on Christmas Eve in this exact spot, surrounded by people she loved. She looked terrible in the photo, gaunt, exhausted, clearly dying, but she was smiling, genuinely, radiantly smiling in a way Thomas had rarely seen in his childhood. This was joy. This was fulfillment. This was someone who'd finally figured out what mattered and had given everything to pursuing it. "I understand now," Thomas said aloud, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. "I understand what you were trying to teach me, that we're not here to accumulate. We're here to circulate. That wealth is worthless unless it flows. That the only thing we take with us when we die is the love we've given and the lives we've touched." He stood, brushing off his jeans, calling the dogs. Tomorrow night he'd be back here, as he had been every night for 6 months, as he planned to be for years to come. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But that was okay. His mother hadn't expected to solve everything. She'd just expected to do something, to act, to refuse to accept that suffering was inevitable when resources to alleviate it existed. Walking home through the quiet streets, Thomas thought about his old life, the boardrooms and investment portfolios, the pursuit of profit and status and success as defined by society's narrow metrics. That version of Thomas felt like a stranger now, someone he'd been but no longer was. His mother's death had killed that man as surely as cancer had killed her, and from the ashes had emerged someone new, Someone who understood that real success was unmeasured in zeros in a bank account, but in the number of people who were better off because UD existed. At the mansion, he went to his mother's room, which he'd kept exactly as she'd left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her books still lined the shelves. Her presence still permeated the space. He sat in her reading chair, the leather worn smooth by decades of use, and opened the journal he'd been keeping. Every night, he wrote about the people they'd helped, their names, their stories, their progress or setbacks. It was a record of the Alley Project's impact, but it was also a letter to his mother, a way of keeping her updated on the mission she'd started. "We helped 23 people tonight," he wrote. 3 new arrivals, scared and desperate. Marcus is working with them to figure out what they need. Kevin finished his first major job, a complete house rewiring. He was so proud. Mother, you would have loved seeing his face. "I miss you every day, but I see you in every person we help, in every small victory, in every moment when someone who felt invisible gets seen. You're still here. You're still making a difference. And I promise I'll keep this going until I can't anymore. Then I'll find someone else to carry it forward. Your light isn't going out. I won't let it." 2 years after Margaret's death, the Alley Project had grown beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. They now operated in 3 different locations across the city, each one maintaining the personal touch his mother had insisted upon. The original Crescent Alley remained the heart of it all, but they'd expanded to serve different neighborhoods, different communities, different populations of people who'd slipped through society's cracks. Thomas had become something of an accidental activist. When reporters discovered what he was doing, how a millionaire investment banker had abandoned his career to hand out supplies in dark alleys, the story went viral. Suddenly he was doing interviews, writing op-eds, speaking at conferences about poverty and homelessness and the failure of systemic responses. He hated the attention. His mother had operated in obscurity by choice, and Thomas understood why. Publicity complicated things, brought scrutiny and second-guessing, and people who wanted to turn the Alley Project into something it wasn't. But he also recognized that the platform gave him power to advocate for the people he served, to push for policy changes, to challenge the narratives that blamed individuals for structural failures. "Your mother would be proud," Marcus told him one evening as they prepared supplies. Marcus was now the project's co-director, drawing a modest salary that had allowed him to save money, eventually buying a small house where his daughter had her own room. But she'd also tell you not to forget the ground-level work. Don't get so caught up in changing systems that you forget about changing individual lives. I know that's why I'm still here every night. Thomas sealed another envelope of cash. They'd refined the system over time, but the basics remained the same. Direct aid, immediate help, personal connection. "How's Elena doing?" "Straight A's this semester. She wants to be a doctor." Marcus's face glowed with paternal pride. "A doctor," Thomas said. "My daughter, who was sleeping in a shelter 2 years ago, wants to be a doctor. Because your mother gave us a chance." Stories like Elena's kept Thomas going on the hard nights, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, when the scale of need felt crushing. The Alley Project had helped hundreds of people directly, and those people had helped others, creating cascading waves of positive change that extended far beyond what could be measured or counted. But Thomas had also learned the limits of individual action. No matter how much money he spent, how many hours he worked, how many people they helped, more kept coming. The underlying causes remained: affordable housing shortages, mental health care gaps, addiction treatment, deficiencies, a minimum wage that hadn't kept pace with cost of living, a social safety net full of holes. He'd become politically active, lobbying for policy changes, supporting candidates who prioritized these issues. He'd learned that his mother's approach and systemic change weren't opposites, but complementary strategies. You did the immediate work to keep people alive and stable while fighting for the long-term changes that would prevent them from falling in the first place. On the second anniversary of Margaret's death, Thomas returned to the alley alone. It was a Sunday, his former brunch day with his mother, and he'd given everyone else the day off. He walked a familiar path with Duke and Bella, who are getting older now, their muzzles graying, their steps slower. They'd been with Margaret through everything, and Thomas couldn't imagine the work without them. The alley was quiet, empty of people for once. Thomas sat against the wall beneath his mother's plaque and pulled out a letter he'd been saving for this day. One of the hospice nurses had given it to him after Margaret's death, explaining that she dictated it during one of her final conscious moments. But she'd specifically requested it not be opened for 2 years. Thomas broke the seal now and unfolded the page. His mother's words preserved in the nurse's handwriting. Thomas, if you're reading this, you've kept your promise. 2 years means you weren't just doing this out of grief or guilt. It means you've truly committed to the work. I'm proud of you. By now, you've learned what I learned, that this work is both everything and not enough, that you can change individual lives while feeling helpless against systemic forces, that the suffering seems endless and the resources finite, that some night you'll drive home crying because you couldn't help everyone, because someone died who shouldn't have, because the world is cruel in ways that break your heart. Keep going anyway. Keep going because every individual life matters. Because systems are made of individuals, and changing individual lives is the only way to eventually change systems. Because hope is contagious, and kindness creates ripples you'll never see. I'm not Saint Thomas. I don't want to be remembered that way. I was a woman who spent most of her life hiding from her own truth, who married for money and security, who enjoyed luxury while others suffered. I don't deserve praise. I deserve exactly what I got, a brief chance at the end to try to balance the scales. But you chose this freely. You gave up comfort and status and success to do work that society undervalues, that makes you better than I ever was. Braver, truer, more genuinely good. The money will run out eventually, maybe in 10 years, maybe 20, depending on how it's managed. When it does, don't stop. Find other resources, rally other people, build something sustainable. Turn my individual act into a collective movement. And Thomas, don't forget to live your own life too. Fall in love, have adventures, create joy. This work is important, but it shouldn't consume you entirely. I spent too many years consumed by either hiding or revealing, never finding balance. Learn from my mistake. Tell the people in the alley that I see them still, that whatever comes after this life, I'm watching and cheering them on. Tell them they matter to me more than anything else in my last months. They gave me a reason to fight for every extra day. Thank you for being my son. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for continuing what I started. I love you. Always have. Always. Well, Mother Thomas read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, soaking into Duke's fur as the dog pressed against him. His mother's voice came through so clearly, strong and wise and unflinchingly honest. She'd known exactly what he'd face. She'd predicted his struggles, his doubts, his exhaustion, and she'd given him permission to be human, to be imperfect, to be enough, even when the problems were too big for any one person to solve. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, right over his heart. Then he stood and looked around the alley that had become sacred ground. How many lives had changed here? How many moments of connection, of hope restored, of dignity given back? The plaque gleamed in the afternoon light, and Thomas touched his mother's name with his fingertips. "I'll keep going," he promised. "I'll build something that lasts. I'll turn your spark into a fire that spreads. And I'll try to find balance, though you made that look a lot easier than it actually is." He smiled through his tears, imagining his mother's response. She'd probably laugh, make some dry comment about how nothing worth doing was ever easy, then tell him to stop being sentimental and get back to work. Walking home, Thomas thought about the future. The alley project would continue to grow. He was already training the next generation of volunteers, people who understood the mission and could carry it forward when he was gone. They were documenting everything, creating a model that other cities could replicate. His mother's approach, keeping it personal and direct while building sustainable structures, was spreading. Mother Bob, more than that, Thomas had learned to see differently. He couldn't walk down a street anymore without noticing the invisible people, without acknowledging them, without understanding that each person had a story, a reason, a full and complex humanity. His mother had given him that gift, the ability to see what most people trained themselves to overlook. At the mansion, he added Margaret's final letter to the archive he was building, a comprehensive record of the Alley project's origins and evolution. Someday, maybe decades from now, someone else would read these documents and understand what his mother had started in a dark alley with nothing but determination and a desire to make amends. That evening, Thomas returned to the alley for the regular distribution. People were already gathering, faces he knew well mixed with new arrivals, the constant churn of need and help and hope. Marcus appeared beside him, and together they began the work. "Mrs. Ashford would love this," Marcus said quietly. "All these people helped because she decided one night to stop looking away." "She'd say we're just getting started," Thomas replied, remembering his mother's fierce commitment, her refusal to settle for comfortable ineffectiveness. "She'd push us to do more, be better, reach further." "Then that's what we'll do." They distributed supplies, shared conversations, connected people with resources, offered dignity in a world that too often withheld it. The work continued, night after night, life after life, building something beautiful and necessary from the foundation Margaret Ashford had laid in her final months. In the darkness of Crescent Alley, lit by scattered streetlights and the glow of human kindness, her legacy lived on, not in buildings or foundations or formal institutions, but in every person who learned to see the invisible, in every act of compassion that rippled outward into the world, in every life transformed by someone who'd refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. Margaret Ashford had been rich in money, but in the end, she'd become truly wealthy in the only currency that mattered: the lives she'd touched, the hope she'd restored, and the love she'd given freely to people the world had forgotten. That wealth would compound forever, growing with interest in the hearts of everyone who carried forward her simple, revolutionary message. Everyone matters. Everyone deserves dignity. And we are all responsible for each other's survival.